Let's start with prayer. Father, we need your Spirit to work in our hearts and minds and imaginations so that what comes from you may rest in our hearts until you give us the gift of obedience. And we pray that we have that gift. And Lord, I pray that if I say things that are not from you, they may be swiftly forgotten and the rest may remain for Christ's sake. Amen. We celebrated our 50th wedding anniversary this last summer. I don't like celebrations, so I didn't want one, but the children said, there's no way you avoid this. And I didn't. And because I have 22 grandchildren who range from 1 to 21, it wasn't in a fancy hotel. We live on a farm, so the kids smartly had a catered meal brought to the farm, and grandchildren were running everywhere. And it was actually delightful. But the most moving moment for me was when my son-in-law sent me his photographs from the day. And as I looked at it, I realized there aren't many places where you could get the 50 people who were there. There was my family and my 5 children family and my brother-in-law's family and one more family from one of his 2 daughters. So altogether, there were, all except one of the grandchildren were there, of mine, so there were 23 children there. None of them had ever in their life had to contemplate divorce. It's very hard to imagine getting 50 people or more together in North America today, and that many families, and no divorce. That's important. And I have a colleague, I don't know her, a friend, but a friend only by repute. We certainly know one another because every Christian professor in North America knows everyone else, with only one intermediate needed. And I speak to about 40,000 people a year, so that's a large network. But I had been saying something like her, but not as richly as she says it. Her name is Janet Smith. Any of you heard of her? Oh, yeah. You have a surprise coming to you if you listen to her. She gives a talk called Contraception, Why Not? You can download it from the web. There's about 250,000 copies circulating. That's how good it is. But she's been saying to her classes, if you will keep my 4 rules, I will pay you $1,000 if you divorce. She's never paid out. Now, I'm going to leave it at that for the moment. I know what you're thinking. Why doesn't he tell us the rules? Because I want you to stew on it for a while, basically. We are fortunate, blessed to have the family we have, and we certainly didn't deserve it or earn it. But obviously it's worth thinking about what can we identify that plays a role in this. All my children are doing good things. I come from a blue-collar background, but that was because the British class system was oppressive as slavery. You couldn't get out of the working class until the 1940s, after the Second World War. If I'd been born a few years earlier than I was, I wouldn't be here today. I would have been working for a motor company or something like that in the British Midlands, or doing something like that, where the Industrial Revolution occurred. All my uncles and my grandfather on my mother's side and my father's side too, they were all technical people. My grandfather was a Rolls-Royce toolmaker. That's the best you can be. 10,000ths of an inch man. That's the limit of human performance. And it's nothing for modern nano tolerances in vehicles. An ordinary production vehicle is better than a Rolls-Royce. It only fails because they want it to fail. It doesn't need to. They want to keep the industry going. And we do need to find work for everyone. It's something we have to think about. But their lives changed dramatically with computerization. In a matter of months, toolmakers went from the peak of performance in the working class to unwanted. And the alienation that has followed in those years is extraordinary. That's what Trump fingered quite rightly, is a political genius at that level, to realise the depth of this alienation. I grew up in the British equivalent of Detroit, and we didn't lock our doors. They were real communities. Every skill was present on the street, and anything that needed doing was done. You bought the stuff, and the guy who was good at it either did it or told other people how to, and what goes around comes around. The police never visited us. We didn't need them. And the men on the street, none of them would have known the meaning of the word ethics, but they taught ethics to their children, sometimes quite roughly. But women could walk the streets at night. My mother had the family gift of the gab. I mean, we're all talkers non-stop, if we get going. But only about serious things. We can be very quiet if there's nothing serious going on. I had no idea how good she was, because she was my mum, and all mums are the same, aren't they? They're interchangeable as far as the kids are concerned, and then they realise they're not. This mum could talk. She ran a Sunday school on her own for 35 years, with 2 weeks off a year. You don't get that commitment these days, do you? 35 years of teaching Sunday school. And she had a class of 30 to 50 kids, aged 5 to 12, in one room, in a Scouts hut. And she never had discipline problems, because she could sing, and she could get children to sing, just like her oldest granddaughter is the same sort of person. And she was a storyteller. And so she taught them all the Bible stories. She realised she'd got a strange little boy from God, so she taught me to read by the time I was about 4. And when it came to learning verses at Sunday school, she said, learn the chapter. You should be doing that. Your children are at peak memorization before the age of 6. Make sure they don't memorize television advertising. They memorize huge chunks of scripture. One of the things that your under 7s can do is beat you at memorizing a psalm. So get them to learn a good number of psalms by heart in that period. They can do it with ease. There's a lovely story told about Dr. Johnson, the writer of the first dictionary. He was a terrible little boy too, because he was hyper smart. And he was giving his mum a hard time one Sunday, and she said, go upstairs and learn the collect for the day. He got to the top of the stairs and said, done that. And he had. We are not making use of the gifts God gave us. You being homeschoolers know about the trivium, don't you? Hopefully. It's at the heart of what you do. Grammar, logic and rhetoric in the right order. Grammar is basically memory. What do? Well, you see, when trendy academics are looking for something to do, and in an area like education, and the problem was solved over 1,000 years ago, the only thing they can do is turn it upside down and pretend they've made some great step forward, which they haven't done. So now we make 23-year-olds try and memorize as though they were 3-year-olds, and we treat 3-year-olds as though they're basically blank slates, which in one level they are, but we don't use the memory they've got at that point. If you don't tell children something is difficult, they don't know it's difficult, they just do it. So we lost our way at that level. Now, in the last year, talking to my children as we approached our 50th wedding anniversary, well, not just the last year, all my children have said the same thing to me at one point or another. Our most important education occurred where? Where in the home? That's right, the dining room table. That is the centre of the house. And everybody must be there. Getting Dad there is the problem. Now, we were fortunate. I went from that blue-collar background, and I got a scholarship. I had no idea what it was. I didn't apply for it. It's just my mother ticked a form on the exam every 11-year-old has to take in England. And in Birmingham, there was a special box, because there was a very special school in Birmingham, one of the 2 best schools in England intellectually. Tolkien went there a generation before me. And he didn't go to school for most of the last year at school. And they knew where he was. He was just down the street in the coffee shop teaching himself Icelandic at age 17. And they knew he was going to go to Oxford anyway. They didn't push him. Quite rightly. as long as you were showing intellectual interest and you weren't fussing about exam results. I, for instance, got sent to Outward Bound School before the most important exams in your whole life in the British system, so that I couldn't do any revision. Because they took the view that if you have to work more hours than God intends to get to the level you want to be at, you're going to pay for the rest of your life. Because you're going to be competing against people who don't have to use those hours to do it. No one should ever want to be a professor. If you do, you're asking for a crown of thorns. But if other people ask you to do it and you say no and they still ask you to do it, okay, you can do it. I once got an award for teaching to which I was not in any way justifiably given. I should not have received it because my basic attitude for a long while was that students were the one thing I wanted to get rid of in the university. The place would be perfect if there were no students there. Basically, I saw a few patients, I ran a laboratory, I wrote papers. That's what I like doing. And that's what they wanted me to do because that brought money in. I had to do some teaching, but at least if you're bringing in lots of money, you don't have to teach till fourth year. And fourth year, honours course, the undergraduates, the object of the first lecture was to make sure that all but 20 of them dropped the class. And I was very good at doing that. I could make the first class really frightening. And then I'd got good students, and that was fine. But I never learnt their names. Until one day, somehow, I maintain it was my good friend, the philosopher Graham Hunter. He says it was me, but one of us somehow stumbled on 4 lines which you could put on your fridge. Because when you hear something said really well, the only excuse for not learning it is laziness. It goes like this. Some seek knowledge for the sake of knowledge. That is curiosity. Well, that's what I did as a research scientist. I played with very expensive Lego and then persuaded people it was worth doing, and could I buy some more, please? And that went on for years. The second line is worse. Others seek knowledge in order that they themselves may be known. That is vanity. From that day onwards, I call my CV, not my curriculum vitae, that's my grandchildren, but my curriculum vanitas. That's what it really is. People don't read my CV, they weigh it. I'm glad they don't read it. It's vanity. Not all of it. God is good. But that's true. The first is worthwhile, the second is not. So, yes, you do want your children to be interested in knowledge for knowledge's sake, but not so that they may be known. The third one is worse still. Some seek knowledge in order to sell it. That is dishonourable. He doesn't mean making a living, but he does mean making a killing. You shouldn't do that, because your soul is damaged. I've done that too. Because as an academic, you have opportunities to do that. More so now, they're trying to control us in various ways, but in my day they didn't bother. And as an academic, you get asked to give lectures every now and again by companies, because the work you do has some ramifications and some applications. And being the cynic I was, I usually said no. But first I always asked when the date was. Because if it was close, I knew that meant they'd asked someone else to do it and they'd withdrawn, and that now they were facing a great deal of embarrassment. You could bid them up to whatever you wanted. I mean, some of the work I did has huge applications. It saved the lives of lots of hundreds of thousands of children probably by now. And it meant that in paediatric hospitals the lectures I gave were listened to. And if they'd promised the lecture as part of a deal to get the milk contract for a paediatric hospital, that's worth having. They didn't want to fail. So years ago I once took them up to $10,000 for a weekend. You shouldn't do that. As for the people taking $1 million bonuses, what's happening to their souls is beyond belief. You shouldn't do that. It's not right. But it was the last one that killed me. There are some who seek knowledge in order to edify others, and that is love. And I was not guilty. I went home and said to my wife, I feel really rather bad. And I quoted those lines and said, I don't even know the names of the 20 students in my class. And she said, why don't you bring them home to supper? I said, would you feed them? She said, of course I will. So we did. I invited them, and to my amazement, they came. And she's an excellent cook. We're not Baptists, so it's a very good meal. Just checking, And then we started talking after dinner. What time do you think they left? After midnight. They came from good homes. We didn't play any silly games. We talked about the questions that matter. And they had never, ever addressed any of them. I usually say there are 9 questions at the heart of all successful cultures. 9 questions with answers. And the answers to those questions actually determine the sort of culture you get. The questions are, where did I come from? Why am I here? Where am I going? How do I come to terms with mortality, particularly my own? How do I deal with suffering, particularly my own? How can I have the temerity, the hope that justice is possible? What can I know? Therefore, what ought I to believe? Everybody has to believe. There's nobody who doesn't have a faith in America. It's just whether they know where it is. Most of them are not even engaging with it, but they have a faith. They're behaving as though some things are true and others are false. You can't live in any other way. So there are things you ought to believe. You ought to make a choice between God and no God. And actually, when you sit down and think about it, God is the rational choice. And then, what ought I to do? How ought I to live? Those are important questions. The first time I mentioned them in the lecture, I was at McGill in Montreal, and I went back to Ottawa, and when I got there, my email inbox had a whole bunch of students saying, where did those questions come from? To which the answer was, I don't know, they've been around since writing began. Pity you didn't know them. Because not to engage with them is not to be fully human. It's engaging with those questions that makes you fully human. Not what clothes you wear. Why do you worry, says our Lord, about what you will eat, what you will drink, what you will put on? Don't worry about them. They're not important things. Worry about the things that matter. Deeply. So that began to turn my life around, and God had lots of things he had to do to me. He allowed me to go on until I was in my 40s before I became alive as a Christian. I grew up in a Christian home. I never ceased to believe. I always realized that if you're an atheist, you're responsible for everything, including the weather, and we can't possibly handle the weather or the climate. I spent my 25 years studying the behavior of one protein in a cellular isolate, and I never understood it completely. If I can't manage that in a test tube, that out there is way beyond anything we can handle. It's utterly ridiculous to think that we can. Now, of course, it's good to see Nobel laureates coming out of the woodwork now and saying, look, this climate stuff is rubbish. Time to ditch it. It's dramatically reduced the development of Africa because that money has been spent on. That could have been spent on useful things. It's being spent on stupid things. And to make carbon dioxide a pollutant, I mean, it's ridiculous. Carbon dioxide is at the heart of the buffer system in your body that God uses all the while. He's not going to allow that to be wrecked. There's a load of rubbish out there, and people believe it. Now, fortunately, that school that I happened to go to, because of that tick on a form, my mother liked the school uniform. She knew it was a good school because she'd been brought up somewhere in the area, but she didn't know anything about what it really was. And in Britain, we make all the right noises about equality, but we don't do it. Because equality is a silly idea, isn't it? We're equal before God as human beings. He loves us all equally. But we are not equal in gifts. And it is a gift to be a Down syndrome child as well. God makes people as they are needed for a flourishing society. And they need training in different ways for different things. Because we wouldn't dream of equality in athletics, would we? Just imagine having, college football games played with a random selection of players. It's so ridiculous. Everybody laughs. But that's what we're proposing for the university. It's silly, utterly stupid. But some form of affirmative action is not wrong. So this school took 100 boys a year on a competitive basis from a population base of 6 million. Of course, 99% of them came from professorial or professional homes. And they went to special classes to prepare for the exams to get in. But the city of Birmingham was socialist, and they gave some money to this school, which is totally independent, but they knew it was good. And they were good socialists, like my grandfather, who wanted money given to things that really worked. But they said, we give you money, we want you to have 2 working class boys in the 100. Take the top 2 from the 11 plus exam. That's affirmative action at a reasonable level, because it's choosing on the basis of raw intelligence. I mean, the 2 working class boys. I came from this blue-collar background where no one had gone to university. No one in my family had gone to university. And I arrived at my high school homeroom, and my homeroom master spoke 5 languages. So I thought, so this is high school. And it was. Shortly, they had me functioning in 3 languages. It's an extraordinary experience. And I loved it because I had no idea what was happening to me. I had no anxieties because I'd already exceeding anybody's expectations in the family. But my life was on an entirely different track. I didn't know that, of course. In fact, going from that school to university was a bore. Medical school was boring in comparison. I played truant a great deal. I never set a fracture in my life. I knew very quickly I would never be an orthopedic surgeon, so why would I bother with orthopedics? I could learn enough from the book to pass the exam in 20 minutes. That was fine. I went climbing mountains instead. And in those days you could do that because we didn't have this absolutely silly nonsense of continuous examinations. There were 2 exams in the whole of the medical course, both lasting about a week. One at 18 months where they threw 45% out, and finals, which you were going to pass in the end. If you got referred, you just had to do one subject next time. You almost invariably ended up as an expert in that subject, because for once you had a subject you could study in some depth. But I never got referred. It was not going to happen to me. I was made for exams, I never had a day of anxiety. Students don't believe me, but I never did. It didn't. Life has not been anxious. And it shouldn't be. That's the promise, isn't it? As long as you don't push yourself beyond what God has made you for. But as long as you also push yourself for what God has made you for, that you're not lazy. Those are the key things. So, what are you trying to do now with your children and your families? How does this happen? Well, I went through medical school, and I met my wife in my second year at university, her first. I was smitten the first time I met her. She denies it, but given subsequent history, we're both in denial about the uncomfortable reality called marriage, The first thing we did, we either went to Martin Lloyd-Jones or John Stott on Sunday. I mean, just imagine that. It sort of spoils you for church after that. And we went to the opera. I liked the opera. She was slightly closer than I was to Covent Garden, so she bought the tickets. We did share the costs. She'd never been to the opera, so given my sense of humour, in the middle of the first opera she went to, there's a famous aria which basically says, "Woman is fickle." But she loved it, and we had some wonderful experiences there over the years. We actually, on one occasion, we were going to hear a soprano. I can't even remember her name that I wanted to hear. And we got to the student seats. You could go to Covent Garden sitting on benches about this wide. They were padded, way up in the gots, for 2 shillings and 6pence, a quarter of a pound. 25 cents. And we heard the greatest singers in the world. But on this occasion, the stage manager came through the curtain just before the start of the opera. That's always bad news. And of course, it was the soprano who was sick. And her understudy was going to sing that night. Now, are any of you opera fans? Probably not. You're Americans. You sing stuff. But the understudy's name was Joan Sutherland. And it's worth putting Joan Sutherland into YouTube. And the mad scene from Donizetti's Lucia di Lammermoor. It was extraordinary. It was electric. Because in the middle of that opera, there is one of the most difficult arias in which the soprano competes with the flute as they go higher and higher and higher. And of course she hit every note. The curtain calls went on for 20 minutes. That was her breakthrough into the big time, and we were there. Wonderful experience. Those kinds of things stay with you for life. But we were both always right, so our relationship rarely lasted more than 7 weeks before we went off in different directions. But of course we kept coming back because everybody else was a pushover and we needed the fight. Our marital text is iron sharpens iron. Now, I lost my way as a Christian because of inadequate preparation as a resident, in your terms. Very dangerous in my day because doctors and nurses lived in the hospital. The young doctors had no official time off for 6 months. You worked for 5 months and 2 weeks. You got unofficial time off when you weren't on emergency call. Your emergency call would go 4 days on, a week off, 3 days on, a week off, 4 days on. That's the way it worked. And you were looking after about 30 patients. It was hard work. And you weren't paid, but you were treated with great respect. You lived in the hospital. I left my shoes outside the door and they were clean in the morning. A maid brought you a cup of tea to get you up in the morning. You know, but you had no money. My first check for 400 hours was $70. I made more money from signing death certificates than I did from my salary. Because in the winters in Britain at that time, the smog, people died of lung disease like flies in winter. And of course, there was no fellowship for a Christian. And nurses and doctors at peak hormone flow, it's inevitable. And my wife actually came and found me after a year or so in Oxford, where I was doing neurology. And the night before she turned up, I'd gone to my room in the hospital, quarters for the doctors. And there was a nurse in bed waiting for me that I hadn't invited. And that was the voice behind me saying, this is not the way. And I felt for the first time the guilt. And then my wife turned up. She shouldn't have married me, but she did. The guy who preached at our wedding took as his text, no man setting out to build a tower doesn't find out whether he's first got enough bricks. And he was looking at me, basically saying, I don't think you've got enough bricks for this project. And he was right. And I knew without the church we would fail. So we went back to church. That's the way my Christian life survived at that stage. Now, I was still very ambitious. We weren't going to have children. Shortly we had 4. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I took the equivalent of boards for a bet because I said, if you're cynical enough, play lots of poker and you'll pass. Because it's all about mind games. I'm very good at mind games. So I passed boards 18 months after getting my doctor's degree. So there were no exams to do after that. But you don't get a consultant position until you're 30, Hobbit-like. The Brits don't think you're responsible before the age of 30. So I had years to fill in, so I went around virtually all the specialties, getting bored with each in turn. And we were not going to have children, but shortly we had 3. And Sally found she loved children more than international relations, and her career path changed. But then she said, I need you at home more than you are at home. You go out before the children are awake and come back after they're asleep. And they see you at weekends if they're lucky. can't you do something different for a bit? And I said, well, I'm bored. I'll get a research grant. So I got a personal grant, first from the Medical Research Council, and did a year's research. I liked it. She said, can you keep this going? I said, sure. So I did a PhD to see my children. It's an unusual reason to do a PhD, but it's a very good one. And it was my money, not the boss's. So he was glad to have me as a free deal. But it meant that I was willing to tell him no, which he'd never heard in his life before. So the first morning in his lab, he's a very busy man, and he didn't come in till about 11 o'clock doing other things. And he said, you're here. Welcome. I'll see you at 7 o'clock in the lab tonight to discuss your project. And I said, I'm sorry, I'm not going to be here at 7 o'clock tonight. He said, why? I said, one of the reasons I'm doing a PhD is so that I can go home and have the evening meal with my children, put them to bed and read to them. He was stunned. Nobody had ever said that to him. And he said, you live on the opposite side of Blackheath to me, don't you? Yes, I said, I live on the poor side. He said, would you come to my house at 11 o'clock? I said, no problem. So from then on, the discussion of the work took place in his study, and we drank his whiskey. What I didn't know, I prayed for that man for 25 years before he became a Christian. And he became a Christian amazingly through an Alpha program. And if there was anybody who wasn't going to become a Christian through an Alpha program, it was him. I didn't believe it. I had to go and check. But when I said no to him, he didn't know what to say because he was feeling guilty. His son had been asked to write an essay about parents at school, and he'd written 6 pages about his mum and 1 sentence about his dad, which said, my daddy is a very nice man whom I see for precisely 1 1/4 days every 2 weeks. So I got to him. I didn't know it. That's why he didn't know what to say. I was a challenge to him. He said to his people, one day he'll grow up, because of course I was supposed to become an academic in Britain, but sadly didn't think that was a good idea. And when I'd finished my PhD, she said, what next? You promised me we'd travel. Can't you find an application for your PhD work in a nice place? So I went through the world literature, and I found it in severely malnourished children, 10-pound 2-year-olds. So for the next 7 years we lived in Jamaica, paid for by the Wellcome Trust, the world's greatest employers. When they take you on, they pay every bill, all the equipment, everything, travel, children's education, everything is paid. They don't want you wasting any time except research. They don't even want written reports, no more than 2 pages, telling us what you've done last year and what you're going to do next year and how much it will cost. That was it. When you tell American academics I lived like that for 7 years, they shake their head in disbelief, because a wonderful way to live. And they had the world's best evaluation system. And Christians need something like this. We don't do it. We don't have spiritual directors like Catholics do. We need to do that. They sent 2 or 3 world-class scientists to Jamaica every January. Not difficult. Especially first-class travel and a nice hotel. But they spent their time with us. 3 of us had these personal fellowships. And we were looking after 10-pound 2-year-olds, if you can imagine that. The criteria for getting into the unit is you had to be a 10-pound 2-year-old or worse. And we had the great privilege over the 7-year period. When we started, it was about a 30% mortality rate. When I left in 79, we went through 100 babies in a row without losing a single one. We cracked it. Hasn't made a scrap of difference to the prevalence of malnutrition in Africa. Because malnutrition is a spiritual disease. The form of spiritual disease that you face is spiritual malnutrition. But physical malnutrition is also a spiritual disease. And I want to imprint this on your mind. This is the thing that got to Ty, got to me too. Now, when I left Jamaica and ended up in Ottawa as a professor of biochemistry and pediatrics, doing, again, a privileged life. I was 40 by the time I settled down a little bit. I had 20 patients a week, only the ones I wanted to see, and ran a laboratory, taught a few students. It's a lovely life. never took work home. My son is now repeating the practice. We're made to be academics. There are at least 3 professors in my grandsons. It's obvious. It's the only thing they're fit to be. We're not fit to be anything else, you know. That's what God made that family for, quite clearly. So I came back to Jamaica, from Jamaica, and ended up in Canada. And every year I'd get a graduate student to try and find a successful nutrition education project in Central Africa, in Africa, below the Sahara. There isn't one. There never has been one yet. If you put into the evaluation criteria the removal of all expatriate input for a while before you evaluate, 2 or 3 years, which is a minimal requirement for effective treatment, hasn't happened. And then my wife again, we joined a little church which I described as the most loving and the most ignorant church I've ever been in. They would sit under a picture of John Wesley and say, become a Christian now. How could you do that? Don't they know any history? No, they don't know any history, as the evangelical church in general doesn't know any history, despite the fact that you're told time and time again to remember the history. We joined this little church because we couldn't find anything like what we wanted. Most of them were just into entertainment, and this one was right opposite the house as well, so I could come after the first hymn, sit in the back row and read a book and listen. I said to the pastor, you have a choice. I can go to sleep. I went because I wanted my children to be there. Or I can read a book and listen to you, and I'll tell you what I would have done with the sermon afterwards if you want to know. And apparently I deny that I said that, but he assures me I did. And sometimes he asks me. But we had some missionaries come, and they turned out to be from the Belgian Congo, and my wife brought them back to lunch. And very swiftly they learnt that I knew as much about the treatment of severe malnutrition as anyone in the world at that point. And they said, we have a huge problem, you have to help us. And I said, how big's the problem? They told me, I said, nobody has a problem that big, you're not making the measurements correctly. And they said, well, come and help us. And I said, in principle, yes, and under my breath, in practice, no. I had too many other personal ambitions, etc. But my wife and children said, oh, you're due a sabbatical, we're all coming. And I had a family war on my hands. I could immediately put about 7 barriers in the way. I thought it was easy. It was going to be expensive to go. Then I got a new graduate student marrying into a travel agency. The price of getting there halved instantly, you know. And one by one, they were all removed. The last one was hilarious. I was giving a lecture in the University of Toronto on the treatment of severe malnutrition, and after the lecture, a very black man came up to me and said, do you ever go to Nairobi? I said, I'm trying not to, why? And he said, I'm the professor of pediatrics there. I would love our students to hear that lecture. I said, I've got to get through Nairobi as quickly as possible because I've got a party at 12 by this stage. If I go, I'm still hoping not to, but if I do go, the hotel bills are going to kill me. He said, no, they won't, because if you'll give a lecture or two, I can give you a house in the university campus for free for as long as you want it. At which point I gave in. I called my dad. I used to call him every Sunday. My mother had died of Alzheimer's a year or 2 before. But I said, Dad, you'll be interested to know that Sally and I, the children, are going to the Belgian Congo, that was Zaire as it was at that point, the DRC now. We're going for a year, where our friends the Englishes were for many years. And he was silent for a moment. And then he said, John, I've waited 47 years to hear you say that. And then he told me, he said, my grandfather, on my mother's side, was a Marxist trade union leader. So she grew up in that kind of environment. And he wouldn't have any favourites amongst his 8 children, so he didn't let her go on with education, even though she got a scholarship. And so she was earning a living as a seamstress, aged about 13, in Birmingham. But by the grace of God, she sat next to a Christian woman who didn't evangelise. Don't evangelise people you're going to spend time with. Don't ever do that. They're going to watch you. That's the way it works. And this woman was smart. She loved her. Earned her brownie points. And then in due course, she said, we've got some interesting missionaries at our church this week. Would you like to come and listen to them? And my mother said, I've got nothing better to do. I'll come. Well, they were faith missionaries. They were with WEC. Some of you may know WEC. They'd gone out, actually, with C.T. Studd. And they had lived there for, by that time, probably 20 years, certainly 15, without any income. WEC doesn't guarantee you a salary. They'll test your call with you and set you up in that way, and they'll send you whatever money gets sent to them for you. And God, of course, had never let them down. And the stories they had to tell were just amazing. So she went back the next night, and the next night she got saved. Now she had someone to write to, because in those days the post got to the Ituri Forest. It doesn't anymore. So they knew when she got engaged, when she got married, and when I was conceived. And from the day they heard that I was conceived, they put me on their daily prayer list. And they prayed that I would become a Christian, that I would become a doctor, and I would go to the Belgian Congo. Nobody ever told me, till all three were in place. That's our God. He can be trusted. And the best thing that happened to our family. My oldest daughter now runs an orphanage in Malawi because of it. My third daughter is an evangelical Catholic with 9 children. Was the one most interested in resuscitating malnourished children. Age 17, she said, "Dad, I'm fed up of working for you. I want to run my own program in the Ituri Forest where the Englishes were." I said, "Can you handle that for a year?" And she said, "Yes." And perhaps foolishly, I let her go. Arranged it. She did it. She set it up, made it work. Came back, a 17-year-old girl across Africa on her own. Walked most of the way. Then spent a month or more in an orphanage in Nairobi. By the time she came back, she was very angry with God for his treatment of African children. My wife had bought her some new clothes, knowing that everything would be worn out. She went up to her room, came straight back down with the clothes, dumped them on the table, said, "Take them back, I'm not wearing them." She didn't wear new clothes for the next 3 years. She only wore second-hand clothes. And then Sally stayed on in Africa, and she was angry with God. She couldn't get at God, so she took me on. It was very tough. And then she went off to do engineering to prove me wrong, because I said, "Look, men are better at one thing than women. You can say that women are better at languages and no one will bat an eyelid, but if you say men are better at spatial geometry, you lose your job." Although it's absolutely true. It's more true than the betterness of women at languages. So she did engineering to prove me wrong. Now, she went to Montreal, not too far away, and I would write to her. Sometimes she replied. But I was going to Montreal, and I sent her an email saying, "I'll take you and your friends out to dinner." And so I did. And when I got there, she got 2 Muslim friends, actually. And they said, "Oh, we love your poetry." I said, "What do you mean you love my poetry?" I write just for my family on occasions. My poems were on their fridges. So I knew that Nicola might not want to talk to me, but she still liked some aspects to who that was. And when she got a degree, she said, "You're right. I have to orientate every drawing before I can use it. Most of the boys don't need to. They can look at it from any direction quite easily and do it." But then the turning point in her life was remarkable. She got a job in New Zealand, but she didn't have enough money to get there. But she wasn't going to ask me for money. That was too much pride in the way. So she did the one thing in Canada that you can do as a student where you can make a lot of money fast if you're tough, and that is to plant trees. As soon as the ground will take trees, it's still going down to -10 at night, but the ground is soft enough to get a spade in, you get 10 cents a tree. And if you're very efficient, you can do one every few seconds. You have to cover every bit of skin you can, because it's the height of black fly season, you get eaten alive. But she did that. And she met her husband there, she didn't know it. He also was a Christian, also fighting with God. He, because he'd gone to work with the severely disabled with the LARSIS organisation, was angry with God about some forms of mental defect, which are very hard for the world to bear and for the people. First seminar I want to go to in heaven is on the diseases I cannot understand how a good God could do, and there are a lot of them. So they met, and they got too close. Shortly before she was going to go to New Zealand, she went to the doctor that morning. Came back, wouldn't say anything to me, and then that afternoon, this young man from Toronto appeared. And they disappeared into her upstairs. It must have been the next day because it was a Sunday. And about 8 o'clock, they came down to our room and said, "We're pregnant. We're very sorry. We're ashamed, but we didn't mean to, but it happened while we were commiserating over how awful God could be." The one thing we know for certain is there's not going to be an abortion. We don't know whether we're going to marry. And Nicola went off to New Zealand, pregnant. I was there for 3 or 4 months. They wrote regularly, had one telephone call a week. Come Christmas, Tim was there at the airport to greet her with us, and spent Christmas with us, then took Nicola to his home. Boxing Day, they still didn't know whether they were going to marry. Then at the end of January that year, a couple of months before the baby was due, they came into our sitting room again and said, "We decided we want to marry, and we've looked at your agenda, it has to be next Saturday." So we had to organise a wedding in a week. And amazingly, everybody could get there. And that was the end of the war with God. He never gave her the answer, except, "I'm God, you're Nicola, and I love you." That's all. And now they have 9 children. Their house is permanently on the edge of total entropy, but it's full of love. And they homeschool. And the kids are marvellous. When they come to the farm, I just have to walk with them and say, "What can you see?" And they can see. They have learned to see. Farms do that. If your kids don't go to a farm or go do that sort of thing, you're missing something important. My youngest grandson, I found 2 of one species of tree frog in 15 years on the farm. He found 4 that afternoon. That's what they're like. They see things. They're fun to travel with, and they start asking good questions. And they know with me that they'll get another question back in return. That's okay. That's the game that Grandad plays. Always asking, "Why do you think that? What would happen if you did X or Y?" Children love that. They're learning amazing things without knowing that they're amazing at one level. They are amazing. I mean, when I told them they've got as many bugs in their body as they've got cells, if you include viruses, you have roughly 10 trillion of each, cells and things you think you don't want, but you actually need. The story is developing very rapidly at the moment, and it's amazing. There's only about 200 bugs that are dangerous for us, and there are thousands of them, many of whom we need. That's throughout the animal kingdom. This, not just commensalism, but actually necessary to one another. So, back to the Africa story, to fill in what happened there and bring you to the takeaway message. After the first year, I set up the program and taught my children to resuscitate malnourished children. So I broke all Canada's child labour laws because all my children started work at 13. They were allowed not to work if they were under 13. That was my son. He played football for the first year with the Africans and learned to speak Swahili. And he's been in contact with those boys ever since, and had 2 of them are Christian because of that long-term relationship now. But they all loved doing it. They all had children die in their arms as teenagers. Didn't do them any harm, except that neither Nicola nor Kathy would finish high school. They did it by correspondence because a bad hair day really didn't seem important after you'd spent a summer resuscitating children. And they were much loved in the area. I'm known in that area as my children's father. And there are lots of little Nicholas and Kathys and Jonathans around there. And going back when they were teenagers, we couldn't drive on the way to the mission, but once we got within 20 miles of the base, they'd say, "Stop!" and they'd disappear into a mud hut to see what was happening. Wonderful experience. But after the first year, I'd trained some nurses, and I'd found a supervisor for a program to keep an eye on how the children were growing. And I got back, and the program was already going downhill. I'm a scientist. I measure things. I was very upset. And then I discovered that one of the nurses I trained had his own child die of malnutrition. That was an insult. I asked him what happened, and he told me he was going to lie by looking at the ground, not at me, and he gave me the answer he knew I wanted, that he hadn't fed them properly. I knew he didn't believe that, but I didn't know what he did believe, so I sent my supervisor. I want to know what he really believed. He was back very quickly. He said, he believes that an evil spirit took the child's appetite away. So he spent his money on the witch doctor, and the child died. That's a rational thing to do. There's not much evidence of a God of love if you're raising your family in Central Africa. Half your children don't make it to maturity. Your crops fail apparently at random, and you have some of the worst governments in the world, and for the last 20 years it's been a civil war. And most women's rites of passage is rape. What evidence of a God of love is there in that? And yet the church is growing. I didn't know what to do. So I was sitting down, thinking, which to my wife was sitting down, doing nothing. And she's an activist. She said, "What's the matter with you? You're not saving lives this year." I'd straightened out the paediatric ward the year before, and it was back to square one when I got back. There's little points. I need to get further than that. I didn't know what to do. And then she won. She said, "You could at least do a Bible study for the African graduates in the village. You send an African graduate to university, our modern universities, it's a pushover for them because they have superb memories. They don't learn anything because they get by on memorize and dump, which is what most of your children are going to do. Many of you did it, right? You couldn't pass the exams you took 5 years ago now. Socrates would be appalled at that. I always wanted to set exams that I could pass. In other words, that required mature reflection. I taught a biochemistry course with no requirement for memorization. The exam did last 8 hours. And it's sorted out those that could think from those that couldn't. That's what it should be about. But anyway, she said, you could at least do a Bible study for these graduates who come back from university, and all they've learned is that I've got a degree, you haven't, and they wouldn't get their hands dirty anymore. They were useless. And they were Christian. There are lots of useless Christians around. It's not a rare commodity, is it? And so she said, you should do Deuteronomy, it's interesting. And here's a passage of scripture you could get your children to learn by heart. Deuteronomy chapters 3, 4, 5 and 6. And I want to take you through them very briefly. I've probably gone over too long, but if you need to leave. It doesn't bother me. I'm a professor. I don't care. But it was extraordinary. They loved it. I speak bad French. My wife speaks very good French, and my son speaks very good French. So between us, we could do perfectly well. But it was French, English to French to Swahili to the tribal language. A bit slow. But after a week or two, they said, we could go from English to the tribal language because Mapendo can do that. What happened? God had sent me a translator who'd walked 1,000 kilometers to get to me, and he didn't know why. That sort of thing shivers up your spine, doesn't it? He'd been born in that tribe, and as a teenager, he'd gone to Tanzania and had been educated in English. He was a Muslim growing up. But a few months before this, he'd become very discontented with Islam, as is happening to lots of Muslims. You can't think about Islam and what it's doing and be very happy about it. And then he started having a dream, as many Africans are having. And it said, go and talk to the Christians. Of course, he resisted, but the dream overpowered him, and he went. He only needed to hear the gospel once, and he was baptized. And then he had another dream saying, go back to your village. So he packed his wife up, and they walked 1,000 kilometers to get there. And he was helping the little Quaker mission. He knew that wasn't what he was there for. He didn't know why he was there. They went and fetched him. He became my translator over the next few years. And he learned, of course, all my talks. And he's been teaching them ever since in the refugee camps. But the tribal elders heard what I was doing, and they called me and said, we want to know what you're doing. The whole tribe converted to Christianity, as a tribe, as Africans do. And our individualistic approach can be questioned. Anyway, they made me say what I was doing, and then they sent me back to my clinic. People waited a couple of hours. Nobody complained. And then a day or so later, they said, we have decided the young men should not be the only people to hear this. You must teach the whole tribe. We're having our annual church meeting 2 weeks' time. We'll give you an afternoon. So I ended up teaching 6,000 people out of doors. Probably the most amazing afternoon of teaching. Well, I've had many, but this is one of them. It's in the top 10. No electricity, but they had a row of D cells about this long, which powered a megaphone. And of course, I only had to talk. My pendo had to do that bit. And I taught them Deuteronomy 4, 5, and 6. Now, this is God's commencement address for Israel. It can be the commencement address for your family. What do you need to do if you're going to flourish? It's about flourishing. And it is absolutely stunning when you really start to think about it. If you ask an Orthodox Jew, why do the Jews always win the real Nobel Prizes? I don't mean the silly ones like peace. I mean the real ones like biochemistry, physics, medicine, not mathematics, that's the field prize, but they're won by Jews every year, at least half of them. 15 million people, they clean up. Why? Well, you ask an Orthodox Jew, he'll send you to Deuteronomy 6. Flourishing. Now, so Moses is not going to go into the Promised Land. And he's talking to the children of Israel about what they need to understand. And he says this, he says, your greatest gift you will not cherish as you should. What's the greatest gift that God gave to the children of Israel? Faith? Well, yes, but no. They often lost the faith. Again, yes, but no. Any others? What? Children, yes, but no. The greatest gift, yeah? That is true, but more explicitly.
Himself. He gave them himself.
Yes, true, but not true, yeah. That's right. It's the law. Because the law can be learned. All the other things you've described are at one level a gift. And Moses is very politically incorrect. He says, your law is better than anyone else's. Try that in a modern university. But he's right. And he says, the tribes around you will look at your law and your God and say, how amazing it is that your God is so close to you. But he says, you're going to trash it. And of course they did, didn't they? Chapter 5 is really for us evangelicals. You may have had a spectacular conversion, but it wasn't like they had, was it? Did you have a volcano with God speaking to you in a language you understood, accompanied by thunder and lightning? No, you didn't. But that was what happened to the Jews, wasn't it? Did anybody who was present at Mount Sinai had no choice about believing in God after that? That, by the way, is why God doesn't turn up in that way. And the Jews will tell you, we suffered for you. They know that. And they didn't do what they should do in many ways. But you see, you would like someone to turn up in the lives of those you love who don't believe in that way, wouldn't you? But that wouldn't achieve what God's project is. I hope when you talk about your life and your Christian life, you talk about a love story. Because that's what it is. Christ invites us into a love story. Now, you can't force someone to love you, can you? That's not love. But he left flowers on the doorstep, didn't he? That's the way he does it. You're not praying for power to turn up in the lives of your loved ones. You're praying for love to turn up. And that happens when disastrous things happen. When Nicola got pregnant, love was at work in that. Those two were made for one another. It would have taken them 10 years to get around to that. God short-circuited that. That's all he did. He doesn't make mistakes. We need to realise that. Now, the law has to be understood in that kind of way. what is the phrase that precedes the first thou shalt not in both Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5? What introduces the law? See, you don't read carefully, do you? You've all read it many times, but nobody's taught you to read. That's what I do in my class. I teach people to read properly. Yeah?
I am the Lord your God.
Completely, yes?
That's no other God.
No. There's one more phrase. Anybody? Oh, you're looking it up. That's cheating, yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to cheat.
Yeah, who brought you out of Egypt? Can you get out of Egypt on your own? No. So faith introduces the law. We have too many dispensational Christians in particular who say, I love under the kingdom, not under the law. No, that's wrong. That's bad theology. Jesus said, I did not come to abolish the law. I came to fulfill it. It remains in place as long as you're committing adultery, lying, and all the other things. But it has changed its function. That's what Jesus did with the law. That's what happens in Matthew 5. The Pharisees thought, if we keep the law, the Messiah comes. The Jews still think that. So Jesus makes the law impossible. He says to men, if you look on a woman with lust, you've committed adultery. That makes us all adulterers without exception. The law is not to make us good, it's to teach us that we need a saviour. If the law had not said, thou shalt not covet, I would never have become a Christian, said Paul. That's my favourite example. The law is a schoolmaster to bring us to Christ. And now, they had the experience of God, and Moses went up the mountain once, came down, and they said, look, we will obey, you go and talk to God. And of course, what did they do while he was up the mountain? They broke the first 3 commandments in order. I mean, if an experience like that doesn't make you good, then what will? You might as well pack up and go home. It's hopeless. But Moses says no. And the centre of Judaism is the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your strength, with all your heart. Your mind is only in the New Testament because the heart includes the mind for Jews. It's Jesus actually using Leviticus, not Deuteronomy. He normally quotes Deuteronomy, but it's Leviticus on that occasion. And it's for us. But what comes next? What follows loving God? Come on, you know you're going to get it wrong, but get it wrong and then you'll remember the answer forever. Right, that's the wrong answer. Yeah, well, now you've had the best learning experience in the class because you won't forget the answer. I always say to students, if you can't remember anything, ask me to ask you in front of 400 others. You never forget the answer after that. No, it's this. These things shall be upon your heart, and you shall teach them diligently to your children. When you sit at table, when you rise up, when you lie down, when you go on a journey. The flourishing of the Jews depends on child rearing. You're doing it right, but you need to deepen it a lot. Now, a little later in the chapter, he tells you how to do it. Do you know how? Note the 2 aspects that are required for teaching, which is why I hate the faculty of education. You must love a subject, it must be on your heart, and you must love the pupil, it must also be on your heart. You can't teach love. That's why the faculty of education is a disaster. I would blow it up if I could. They can do research, but they can't pretend to teach teaching because it's a gift or a calling. It's not something that can be taught. Have we got any Wendell Berry readers here? Just one. Yeah, I haven't done a very good job. Oh, another one. Yeah. Are you two related? No. Have you read Watch With Me? It's not in print. It's the first of the Port William novels. Have you read that one? You need to get it in your church library. You have to get it second hand. They should reprint it at some time. Wendell Berry, it's one state over, isn't it? Kentucky? Yeah. He's my age, a year or 2 older, along with Peter Kraft. Met all good friends with Peter Kraft. I met Wendell Berry once. We don't get on too well because he stopped going to church. But we respect one another. But he was much smarter than me. He realised when he got tenure at a major university, the university had lost its way back in the 60s. So he chucked that away and went back to his roots in Kentucky, growing tobacco and having a small farm, writing novels, essays, and the like, poetry, wonderful poetry. And he has written the imagined history of an imagined community, like Blacksburg, but in Kentucky, Port William. And in the first of the Port William novels, it's a love story between a great gawky farmer called Ptolemy and a village schoolmistress called Miss Minnie. One-room schoolroom, horse and buggy days, before the motor car had arrived. And they're made for one another, but they don't realise it. So the story is built around their gradual awakening to the fact that they're made for one another. They both think that they would make a great spouse to someone else. And it's hilariously funny. He's a great comedic writer. But his introduction of Ptolemy and Miss Minnie nails the Faculty of Education. It's Miss Minnie that nails the Faculty of Education. He says of Ptolemy was a big man, a bit like Ty, whose clothes look as though they have been taken by surprise 20 minutes after he puts them on. Again, a bit like Ty, right? That's Ptolemy, and wonderfully warm-hearted. He had 99 acres, and he never coveted the extra one. Miss Minnie, on the other hand, was the exact opposite. Small, petite, neat, very organised. Her school ran like clockwork. If a boy misbehaved, father would be spoken to, punishment would be delivered, and the world would go on, But he says of Miss Minnie that Miss Minnie went to teachers' college, where she learnt many cunning techniques, which she never subsequently used, because Miss Minnie loved children, and she loved books, and she taught by merely introducing the one to the other. Homeschoolers have a flying start because they love the pupil. Their problem arises when they haven't yet been inspired to love the subjects. That's where people like me come in, to do a little bit of that inspiration. But you're halfway there straight away. And in fact, you'll learn more than your children will in many ways. That's important on your hearts. And later in Deuteronomy 6, Moses says this: when your son asks you why you do the things you do, why we live the way we do, like your son saying, why are we going to church, it's boring, that sort of question, do not give him a lecture. Do not impose authority. Tell him the story. We were slaves in Egypt. God rescued us, brought us through the desert into the promised land. God did this for us. Shouldn't we spend an hour or two a week with a God like that? Up to the age of 7, children are honest. They'll say yes. Then they learn to rationalise by watching you. And that's the rest of life, dealing with our rationalisation of our own desires. I didn't allow God to decide what I did, even after my Christianity came to life in my 40s. I still decided what I would do, by and large. It wasn't until I was in my 50s that for the first time in my life I gave a summer to God. Rather grudgingly, or casually, whatever you want to say, but when the war happened in 1994, my wife stayed on because she was on the board of World Relief Canada. She was the first there before the NGOs arrived. She saw 30,000 people die in a week of cholera. She climbed over roadblocks made out of dead bodies, and she ran half a dozen refugee camps for a couple of years. I went out to see her in the summer. And because of her, I ended up teaching that summer. I'd said my research project in the area was ruined. I wasn't going to do that. I went to see my wife. I knew she'd find somewhere nice to live in Bukavu. It's one of the most beautiful places on earth. She had. But I didn't spend much time there. I spent most of the time in the refugee camps, teaching for up to 6 hours a day, every other day for 2 months. I was in tears. They were in tears. And I was the happiest man in the world. On that occasion, I felt his pleasure. That doesn't happen very often. Don't consult your feelings. They're highly unreliable anyway. You know neither where they come from nor where they go. It's your mind that God wants controlled. Don't ask, what do I feel I should do? Because you've lost the argument already. The devil will win that one every time. Ask the question, what do I know that I ought to do? And do it. You ever notice the parable at the end of the Sermon on the Mount? The man who builds on the rock and the man who builds on the sand. What is the difference between those two men? That's the point of a parable, to know what the parable is saying, right? So what's the difference between two men? Come on, if you don't get your children snapping answers faster, you do have something in you think surely you have something to say. You know you're probably going to be wrong, because I wouldn't be bothering to answer the question. But that doesn't matter. That's a learning experience. What's the difference between them?
One man was foolish, one man was wise.
That's true, but that's not what Jesus is concerned about. The choice they made is important, yes. In what way?
The material that they used.
No, that's not the key.
It's the foundation.
No.
The outcome of what happened to them?
No. It says
Planning.
both the men heard the word, one obeyed. It's about obedience. That's all we have to learn. Obedience. The third beatitude is blessed are the meek, right? What that means is beautifully portrayed when you realize what the word is used for. Barclay is a guy to go to for this stuff. The word that's translated meek, which is what Jesus wants you to be, is used to describe a horse that has been broken in, trained, and is ready to ride into battle. Do you get the picture? You are meek when you wake up in the morning, having gone through the first two beatitudes that morning already, and you say to the Lord, thank you for grace, ride me into battle today. Isn't that a wonderful metaphor? To think of yourself being ridden into battle by Christ every day. That's what he wants to do. Does the horse have any big plans for the day? No. He just has to be obedient. That's it. It's a wonderful metaphor. A few months ago in California, I was talking to about 50 physicians, and just as I was about to start, a young woman came in, very full of life, surgeon. She said, oh, good, I'm in time. And she said, I think of you every day. I go to work. I said, why? She said, 10 years ago, you taught me what it means to be meek. And every morning, I get out of my car in the car park, and I say, Lord, ride me into battle, and then I'm ready for the Department of Surgery. What a wonderful thing to have happen in your life, things like that. They happen to me all the while now. Things that have happened I didn't get it right, I got it wrong, so I share the things I got wrong. I didn't get to grips with the Sermon on the Mount until, again, I was in my 40s. God is not in a hurry. He doesn't need us to do anything. He can do it without our help. But he wants to give you the dignity of causality. When your children come to you and say, Dad, what you taught us at the dining room table is the centre of our lives. That brings you to tears, doesn't it? I don't cry easily. I can go into a tragedy and do, what's necessary to save the lives that can and leave the ones that can't to be comforted by whoever can do it. The only thing that gets to me every time is grace. My wife has paid a very high price for what she did. Basically, she's had post-traumatic stress since then. In many ways, she functions. She's not non-functional, far from it, but she's not happy. God knows what he's doing, and I hope to see the conclusion of that on this side of heaven, if not the other side. But at the end of that summer of teaching in Bahia, as it was then, I had one of those moments that you will never forget in your life. And the Psalms are full of having memories. That's what in trouble you don't try and feel good. You remember what God has done. And you won't have really good memories if you push, unless you go beyond your comfort zone, as it happened to me that summer. It's my wife who knew that God had given me talents and pushed me along the way. I denied them because I'm thoroughly irresponsible at heart, and so if you're a Christian, you have talents, you have duties. I don't like that. I prefer to be on my farm now, really, in many ways, but I've got to a stage now where I'm really enjoying, I hope it's apparent that I'm enjoying what I'm doing now. But Sally said at the end, she said, there are a lot of pastors in my camps. They ought to have a day with you. All the missionaries ran away from the war, by the way. They couldn't handle it. Because they didn't know about Deuteronomy 6. They don't know what their job is to teach people the stories that will give them structure to their lives. That's what happens, you see, that when you teach the stories to your children, I should have put this in now, so I better put it in before I forget to do it. It's a key point, and I nearly missed it. But those stories, all children have a need for repeated stories, don't they? Now, your children have favourite stories. They probably need examining what books they have access to. There are too many trendy books written by liberals who are basically destroying the culture. There are only 6 stories in the world that are capable of running a big society. The biggest one of all over time is animistic paganism. That's not an insult, that's just a description. That's the belief that the world is under the control of evil spirits. There may be a creator way back there, but he's not interested in us. Life locally is under the hands of evil spirits who are totally arbitrary. So if you believe that, you cannot do science, because you have to believe that nature is law-driven underneath. And we believe that because God is a God of integrity and a God of order. That's the only reason we could do science. It's the reason that experimental science happened in Christian Europe and nowhere else. No other culture got to experiments. The crown jewel. And we don't make that point. We don't know how to make it. Once you see it, you can make it easily. But most of us don't know. Now, the stories that they tell are largely animal stories, and they're appearing in children's picture books now. And we need to watch for these. A little animal beats a big animal by trickery. The Brer Rabbit stories that are in this part of the world, they came from West and Central Africa into the Caribbean and here with the slave trade. And a con man is a hero in a society where the major stories in a child's life are Brer Rabbit type stories, or the hare and the tortoise, or the mouse and the elephant. There's lots of them, but they all have the same character. That's animistic paganism. It will never do science. That's why you can't do nutrition education. You've got to change the culture. When I taught that afternoon, the next day, at the end of the afternoon, I said, I know you came to the Lord and you had a subjective sense of Christ in salvation in the Rwanda revival. You remember it. You danced in the streets with joy. But you spent the next N years putting more into the church music than into teaching, which we do all the while. Nobody practices reading the scriptures, but they spend hours learning to play silly songs. That's the wrong way around. Reading the scriptures matters. When I'm preaching, I say to the church, I don't want anybody reading the lesson. I want to read it. And it's normal for people to come up afterwards and say, it was amazing. I understood that passage more than I ever understood it at all before you said a word about it. It was just the reading of it, because I know how to read. Now, the next stories are East and West. East, Hinduism, Buddhism, fatalistic like animists, because they explore what they know best, which is themselves, and they have no story of the fall. So meditation techniques come from the East. In the West, all 3 religions have the story of the fall. So we explore God's handiwork to learn about God as a natural consequence of understanding the fall. But in the case of Islam, it's spoiled in that Allah is arbitrary. He can do what he likes. There is no logic to him. That's why Muslim doctors are not very good. Not because they don't have the intellect, but because they're fatalistic. They give up too easily. The lab that I worked in London supplied nephrologists for the military hospital in Riyadh. I didn't actually go, I didn't get a chance, but the ones that came back, they all had the same story. They said, those guys, a dialysis machine stops and they say, Inshallah, the will of Allah. And we say, no it isn't, it's a fuse, fix it. We have an entirely different view. When you here in America train Muslim pilots on F-16s or wherever it's up to now, they crash on the simulators more than Americans do, because they take their hands on them and say, Inshallah. Christianity doesn't do that. Different story, different outcome. Now the Jewish story gives us ideas of justice and law. Jesus adds compassion and mercy to that law. But we still need both. Those are the only stories in the world that will make sense. And depending on the repeated story in your child's life, you get one of those 6. Now, the trouble is, one that won't last very long, a post-Christian heresy called capitalism, as a religion, is a disaster. Both communism and capitalism actually share the same heresy. They would both be all right if one Christian doctrine was false. What's that Christian doctrine? The fall. Communism would be perfect if we were good, because we wouldn't exploit one another, and there wouldn't be any power struggles. Capitalism would be fine if we were good, but without God we start paying ourselves millions of dollars and keeping other people in poverty. That's the problem. So at the end of that summer, I ended up teaching African pastors for a weekend. And at the end, one Rwandan pastor who spoke good English thanked me beautifully. Then he turned to my wife and said, "And your wife is the most honoured lady in all these camps." I'll never forget that moment. That's our God. That's the message you've got to transmit to your children. And you've got to get mother and father on the same page. And it's dad's job to see that all the stories of the Bible are transmitted to his children, preferably before the age of 8. And if you do that, you'll produce a good citizen, by and large. Not 100%, but very much by and large. You cannot bring your children to Christ. Only the Holy Spirit can do that. Unless you are born of the Spirit, you cannot comprehend, you cannot see the truth. Think of your own conversion. I guarantee in most cases you would immediately say, yes, that's right. Any new information arrive when you became a Christian? No. You simply saw what was there before in an entirely different light, which was a gift from God. So when I'm talking to people on the way, I don't tell them to become a Christian now, ever. I'm very patient. I waited 25 years for one of my friends who last year made the final step. He's a journalist, one of the best in North America. PhD in history, speaks 3 languages. Conservative journalist before he was a Christian. We met 25 years ago when he came to report on a lecture I was giving in Ottawa, and as he walked out he said to another journalist, the only Christian journalist I know in Ottawa, and said, "I enjoyed that, didn't expect to from him." And she said, "Would you like to meet him?" And he said, "Yes, as long as he doesn't know." She arranged it. We became friends. We used to meet regularly and argue about faith, whether atheism was actually rationally defensible or whether Christianity was rationally defensible. We enjoyed it. And then about, I don't know how many, after about 5 or 10 years, he wrote a wonderful piece in the main newspaper in the capital city, the Ottawa Citizen. Its title was, "Why Taking the Cross Seriously Can Make You Very Cross." I've been getting at him. And it went like this: the Eastern Mediterranean at the time of Christ was not an ignorant backwater, but where Greek learning, Jewish theology and Roman pragmatism met, some fishermen, a tax collector, and a man who had a seizure on the road to Damascus persuaded their friends and neighbours and then the whole Roman Empire that a dead Jewish carpenter was God. How weird is that? And this God didn't prance around in power, but allowed his creatures to nail him to a stick on a dunghill, and that changed the history of the world. How weird is that? Even when wild Norsemen met the Irish monks won the argument. And I, as an atheist, have to acknowledge that Augustine and Aquinas all the way up to C.S. Lewis were not stupid. So if I'm going to be honest, I must read the scriptures. But I'm mortally afraid that if I do, the monk will win the argument. I immediately sent him an email, of course, when I saw it, and said, "John, I wish I'd written that." And he said, "You wrote one sentence, but you promised me you'd be available when I need to talk. I need to talk." I thought you did, but you've chosen a bad day. The cook's away. We'll have to meet in the pub. So that evening he turned up. And he said, "Well, I'm not an atheist anymore. There's got to be a mind behind the universe, so I guess I'm a theist. But what do I do with Jesus?" Now you, of course, being well trained, would immediately tell him the gospel, right? I didn't need to. He knows the gospel. There's no information he needs. I said, you don't expect me to answer that question, do you? This is far too much fun to watch. The next step was actually not expected. It was about 5 years after that when he called me and said, my girlfriend and I both now believe in God, and we would like to get married. We don't yet believe in Jesus. Can you find a priest who'll marry us? I said, yes. So they got married. There was one witness pulled in off to the street at the last minute, that was it. He's done some interesting work on the nature of law, and I asked him to speak at a summer program I run every year. And the second time was last year, and I said, how do I introduce you this year? And he smiled. He said, you can now introduce me finally as a very quiet Christian. It's not so quiet, actually. You can see it in his writing, in his editorials that he writes in the National Post, the best newspaper in North America. That's our world. That's the world we have to transmit to our children. Starting with a sense of wonder at God's nature, what He's created, and working outwards. And keeping the Sabbath, a day when you don't work. And make that so much part of their lives that they will never be tempted to pass an exam by working on Sunday. If you have to work on Sunday, you're making a cross for yourself. I took holidays before important exams, usually a week. Later, as a professor, I realized, especially in oral exams, students dig holes and then fall into them. And it's invariably things they don't really understand. They've tried to memorize in the last week, and it comes back garbled. You can't be expected to know everything, so it's more important to know what you know well, therefore permanently. So teaching them constant review is a good thing. And random review in relationship to what they find hard to memorize, understand, and what they find easy. That's worthwhile. And teach them all to write précis. I'll leave that for you to stew on. There are probably going to be questions, but some of you probably need to go. I don't know what time I'm supposed to go to. How long have I got?
We have 15 minutes for questions.
Oh, that's not too bad. Yeah. Except usually it's longer than the lecture. Have a guess and where it was. I tell you, the worse it gets, the longer the question period. So it's liberal audiences that have the longest question period. You'll never guess. The University of St. Petersburg in Russia. I gave a lecture from 5 till 6 and the questions went till midnight. Yeah. Things were bad, so the questions went on and on and on. Only stopped then because they wanted to catch the last train back to their living places. New York's had 3 hours. Evangelicals, never more than an hour. Not yet awake, but waking. Any questions?
What was the last thing that you had to teach them to write?
Précis. French word for precise.
Oh, okay.
And it is a technique. In the Middle Ages, it was a standard way of teaching. You got your masters in the Middle Ages not by doing anything original. Clearly, you couldn't do anything original at that stage. Why ask you to do it? What you did was take what everybody knew to be good and you rewrote it to see whether you'd understood it. Now, the first thing I do every year at Augustine College when the students arrive, most of whom are evangelical, the odd one Catholic, and they're good kids. It's a very countercultural thing to do, so it takes courage to come. And the first lesson they have to learn is a bit shocking. I say, well, you've all read Ephesians 1 and 2 many times, right? None of you would deny that. Could any of you tell me the argument of Ephesians 1 and 2, straight off? Is it immediately available to you? I know the answer is no. If you write a précis of Ephesians 1 and 2, you will get the argument and you'll never forget it again. Now, the best way I can explain it that you will remember, I usually use a building as the metaphor. If a building needs upgrading, rejuvenating, and it's a really serious job, you're going to take it right down to the basic weight supporting structures. In other words, you're making it into an ugly structure, but you can see how it works and if any of the bits are in critical need of replacement. That's what you do with a précis. The first thing you do is remove every adverb and adjective, because it's not essential to an argument. Any example or metaphor, you just put square brackets with some clues to remind you what illustration is there. That's why, by the way, why Lewis is very difficult to write précis of, because he doesn't complete his arguments. Lewis's brilliance is the metaphors that he comes up with. They are fantastic. And he's writing for ordinary people. He knows if he's got the right metaphor, they're going to hold on to that, and they'll work the rest out for themselves. That's why philosophers hate Lewis, because he doesn't make himself vulnerable by completing the arguments. They're in trouble. So you remove metaphors. Every complex sentence must be reduced to simple sentences. Paul writes inordinately long sentences. That's why I like reading him, because I don't read words, I read sentences. Just as we all conduct music, but we go with the music. The conductor, of course, doesn't. He's in front of the music, drawing it out of the orchestra. You should read it in the same way. But when you've done that, you can reduce the first 2 chapters to about 15 lines, and you will have the argument forevermore. It's a very clear argument. It's just that Paul has embellished it in the way that Paul likes to do. That's why Jesus taught by stories. Thank God he did. Muhammad wrote everything down and said, Allah said this and it can't be changed. They're stuck in the 7th century and they can't get out. But that's their problem. When people ask Jesus a question, he'd say, good question, let me tell you a story. Now you go figure it out. And we've been figuring it out ever since. That's the way it works. But if you teach your children to write a précis, if they're going into science, for instance, you will take a year off a PhD program simply by knowing how to write a good précis, because you've written your introduction by the time you've written those précis. And you'll also know where the weaknesses are in the current argument, because it shows up when you remove all the trimmings. Most scientific papers claim to prove more than they have actually proved. Any other questions?
If the key is the father teaching the stories of Scripture, what do you say to a father that doesn't know Scripture?
Well, that's the problem. God is good to you. He will make up for that. But this is the ideal way. The sins of the fathers are visited on the children. That's one of the ways in which it happens. If your father is not interested, it's going to scar you, particularly as a little boy. Divorce is one of the biggest problems. And I can say to any liberal audience now, as I say it all the while, I know you hate divorce. And you see the body language, say, how dare you say that? It's so unkind to divorcees. And I say, I know you think I shouldn't say that because it's unkind to divorcees. It's not unkind, actually, but we'll come to that in a moment. But I can see the bubble over your head. You do hate divorce, and I can tell you why. If it hasn't happened to you, it's happened to your friends, hasn't it? Has any child ever enjoyed it? No. That's why you hate it. And those of you who have sadly gone through divorce, the thing to do is not to ask your children to say it's okay, because it's not okay. But they do still love you. Just say, I'm sorry. That's what they need to hear. I'm sorry that your life has been less than it could have been because of what we foolishly did. If we hadn't been so foolish, we wouldn't have married. That's why counselling before marriage is so important. And why, if you're having sex before marriage, you should stop for 2 years before you marry, to make sure you're marrying for the right reasons. Marrying for sex is a very bad thing to do. But that's another whole lecture. Yes? A bit louder, please.
You mentioned a lady that offered $1,000.
Yes.
What were the 4?
I told you to download the CD.
Okay,
Just put contraception, why not? But I will tell you. The first one is the obvious Christian one. Don't marry somebody who doesn't share your beliefs. And parenting and marrying when you do have shared beliefs is tough enough. Without it, you must have a substandard marriage, or less than God intended. The second one is interesting. Not one I would have thought of. Practice charity together every year. Sit down together and give 10% of what you've earned in the year to people less well off than yourself. One of you will be much more charitable than the other. so one will make the other a better person. The third one is no sex before marriage. She's honest. She works in the university. She said, I know that many of you are sexually active, and that's where she's right to say that you need to stop for 2 years before you marry. If he can't love you without sex, he doesn't love you, he loves sex. One of the joys of the college is, I look every year, there's roughly a 10% probability that a couple is going to emerge out of that year. And they have no idea, of course, and it doesn't happen in the first term. But what better way of finding a spouse than studying together and finding you like this person, you like the way they think, you like who they are, before you even think about bodies. A couple of years ago, I was a proximate cause of a marriage, as happens not infrequently. I've been speaking at an apologetics conference in the Fraser Valley in British Columbia. There were 1,500 people there, so I didn't know everybody in the audience at all. But in the audience was a young man who'd Christian, and he got a good job in IT. He trained in that area. But God was getting at him and saying, "This isn't. You're going to use those skills, but I want you to do more than this." He didn't know where it was. But after listening, he said to himself, "I'm going to go and take that course." And he applied, and he came. About a month later, I was in Toronto speaking to the Ravi Zacharias organisation. And after the lectures, Ravi's organising secretary for Canada came to me and said, "I'm going to come and take your course. I'm going to take a break." I said, "Yeah, you're going to leave Ravi to come to our Tim Pot little organisation?" She said, "Yes, I am." And she did. There were 3 of them in their 20s that year, the rest the usual, home Christian schools thinking about university. Those 3 obviously became good friends. They went off at Christmas. When they came back, Steve said to Brittany, "I want to say something to you, and you can tell me to stop, and I will. But I want to tell you, I think I thought about you every day during the holidays." And she smiled and said, "I thought about you too." And they were married that summer. That's ideal, isn't it? That's perfect. That's the way it should be done. Anyway, the last one is practice natural family planning. Hold on to your seats at this point. Actually, modern natural family planning, we've learned a lot more over time, is as effective as the pill. But it does involve self-control. And none of us have enough. But that's as God intended it. And basically, God says to you, on all but 35 hours a month, I'm not there. It doesn't matter. You're not going to get a baby. But if he decides to turn up in those 35 hours and turn you on for one another, you're probably not going to be able to resist. And he knows what he's doing. Because the most stupid thing you can say is we need to get used to one another before we have children. No, children are the best way to get used to one another. They are God's sandpaper for removing the sharp edges from both of you. That's what they're for. That is one of the purposes, one of the 3 that he made marriage for. She's very funny. She's hilariously quick. So you can have a lot of fun. If you've got a couple that you know are thinking about marriage, invite them to a meal or at least dessert and coffee. And so we've got this interesting CD. And watching them, their faces as it goes through is hilarious. But as Ty will tell you, when I first came here following the massacre, and I don't remember the talk I had with the students, the medical students. I have no memory of it, but it certainly happened. And I told them that the best time to start a family if you're doing medicine is actually medical school. Otherwise, if you become a specialist, you're probably going to be infertile by the time you get married. And children put the medical course into perspective. It's not difficult to do medicine. You don't need to get neurotic about it. And a 2-year-old can put it in place. I mean, if you've had a very bad day, the first time you kill a patient, not intentionally, but just because you're not as good as you're going to be, you feel awful. You tell no one. But if you go home and there's a baby, a 2-year-old boy decides he's going to jump out of the window above your head and say, "Catch." Everything's put in perspective in a few microseconds. God knows what he's doing. Trust him. And, of course, I didn't sort this out till my two first children were married, and they handled their fertility in the non-Christian modern way. The last two didn't. Because you can't actually say to God, I want you to be in charge of all my life, and then add except my fertility, can you? That's incoherent. You don't want to be in charge of all your life. You're telling him that. You're saying you don't know what you're doing. I think that's a difficult thing to say to God, actually, and one day you're going to have to give an account of why you said it. I'm not looking forward to it on my case, although we didn't use the pill because I wouldn't let Sally use it, because when it started off it killed people. And it was too late by the time they got the dosage down. It still kills people anyway. And it causes breast cancer. Not surprisingly. It's part of the causation anyway. So what happens is the relationship in the marriages of my last two children is much better than the older ones. Because our sexual drives are so different between male and female. Both sides have to learn about the difference. I mean, men, surprise, surprise, are very simple creatures. We have one hormone. That's all we need. And it doesn't change. So we're always ready, anytime, any place. Women, on the other hand, when you look at their hormones, they look roughly like the Rocky Mountains. So you don't know what you're going to feel like in the morning till you're awake, right? We're the same every morning. We get up, we put on the same clothes, drive the same way to work, eat the same breakfast, come home, eat the same dinner as yesterday and say thank you. I mean, that's who we are. Very simple, utterly reliable, if you just cater for a few little whims that we have. That's all you have to do. But I say you can always tell a natural family planning guy, because he comes home with flowers when he's done nothing wrong. It's just that time of month when it's a smart move. And my son loves teasing me with the birthday cards he gets. He knows I've never had one like them. Because I get birthday cards. And it's Love Sally, you know. Maybe a sentence, usually not. But Jonathan, he gets a page every time. And the last one began, My Prince. And now Jonathan knows Sally has never even thought of that as a possible designation for me, you know. Very different relationships. Because much more empathy. Based on a real understanding of the difference between male and female. I think women are having the hardest time at the moment because the pressures on women are absolutely immense. And you're much more dutiful than men. So the current university system almost guarantees that you'll be promoted beyond your competence. And that's the worst thing that can happen to anyone. There's no correlation between performance in medical school and performance as a doctor. And these days, almost invariably, a woman is top in medical school, and usually she doesn't complete residency. Because she's so dull and boring. Usually Asian, pushed by families, and they study so much they're not at all interesting. And of course, patients don't arrive with a mark on their forehead saying, I'm handout number 24. That isn't the way it works. So they drop out. The whole system is out of control. And the church is the only place where it can be renewed. Starting with what you're doing, homeschooling, and then building better families, and then building the life of the mind in the church again. Reading better stuff. Not reading trashy Christian romances, right? I have a particular aversion to those.
It's 11:30,
yeah.
which is what time I told the...
If you want a summer reading that's really worth reading, a novel that's like no other that you've ever read. How many Michael O'Brien readers have we got here? Any? One. He's become a fan. I mean, he drove 60 miles to meet Michael O'Brien the last time he was up in Ireland. He's a man who didn't go to university, so his mind was not destroyed by the university. And there's a novel called Island of the World. It is this thick, but I guarantee it will reduce you to both tears and prayer. I don't know anybody who's read it who hasn't had that experience. I haven't read a novel like this. And if you had a women's reading group about that novel, it would have an impact on your church. It's stunning.